Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things about my picks going into the season, how I don't feel super confident in any of them, but I kind of like it that way. It shows you just how crazy this season is going to be, and if you feel totally confident in your picks, I think you might just be a little bit crazy if I'm being totally honest. But let's get into segment 2 here. And the big question I have, are we underestimating the number of changes that the realignment teams are going to have to face? Are we talking about these Oregons, Texas, Utah? Are we talking about these teams a little bit too highly when they head into a new conference where there's going to be a lot of changes? And there's a number of things to unpack here, whether it's the atmospheres, the strategy of the games, the familiarity with the opponents plays a huge part. The familiarity with the atmospheres that you're walking into is another huge part of this. So let's go ahead and jump in. And the place I want to start is the SEC, and we have the same exact picture for it. I want to start in the SEC and talk about Texas and Oklahoma here for a second, because a lot of the biggest things that have been talked about is the physicality changes and all the different things that they're going to have to face at the line of scrimmage, and that is going to be a big part of this, no doubt about it. But the biggest change, at least in my opinion, is going to be the defensive approach of a lot of these teams that they're going to face. When you talk about the Big 12 and the way that it works in the Big 12, at least in the past couple of years, the way that it's gone down, it's been a lot of we're going to rush 3, maybe 4 guys and then drop a lot of guys into coverage and then just make you beat us. You know, you're going to throw into tight windows. Anything that is underneath, we're just going to rally and tackle and make sure that it is a bend, not break type system. And that was a good way to go about business, mainly for Texas, because there were a lot of people that were able to stifle Texas with that respect. And it really came down to when Texas and OU walked onto the field with a number of Big 12 teams, they were bigger, they were faster, they were stronger. That was just the plain simple truth. Now, that doesn't mean they won a lot of games, because you saw what happened to Texas the last couple of years. But overall, I think you look at these teams, there was a way that Big 12 teams had to combat some of that physicality that OU and Texas brought to the table that others didn't. And it was a great way to do it. Play that drop 8 coverage, drop everyone back, make sure that all of the passing windows are very tight, make sure everyone is covered, and then when a pass is thrown, rally to the ball, make that tackle. And it's going to be a little bit different in the SEC, and mainly the biggest difference is going to be they're not scared of you anymore. They can match up person for person, physicality perspective, bigger, stronger, taller. They are all of those things. There is no doubt about that. They are absolutely on par, if not a little bit above, both these teams when it comes to that respect. And that's going to be the approach. It's not going to be, let's drop 8 in coverage because we know we're not going to be able to handle this offensive line. It's going to be, let's go at this offensive line. Let's play man coverage on the back end and, let the chips fall where they may. And that's actually what Texas is going to do a ton this upcoming year, mainly because of personnel. But overall, you look at these teams, and I think it's not necessarily about, can they handle the physicality? Because, frankly, I think both these teams can. And the question is, can they handle it week over week, which is a totally different conversation. But overall, I think they can handle the physicality. The question is when, Quinn Ewers is back to pass, and there's 5 people coming at him instead of 3 or 4. That changes the entire game. Can he be good enough out of blitz packages to handle all of the things that are going to be in front of him? And on the flip side, Jackson Arnold, this offensive line does not look all that great right now, and turnover troubles have been a real thing for them. So can he handle that? If someone is in his face right away, is he going to be able to deliver the pass the way that he needs to? So overall, people look at Texas as the team that has the upper hand heading into this one, and I tend to believe that as well when you talk about the number of guys that they have on the lines of scrimmage, especially the O-line. I feel a little bit more confident in what they can do against this defensive approach, but at the end of the day, it is going to be something that they're going to have to adjust to. Quinn Ewers is not going to have quite as much time to digest offense or digest defenses and get the ball out as he did in the past, because they're not going to drop 8 in coverage. They're going to drop 4, or not 4. They're going to drop about 6, maybe 7 in coverage at any given moment, and it's going to be a lot tougher for him to figure out, the nuances of that. So overall, it's kind of a defensive change that I think is going to be the biggest one for Texas and OU, and could cause some real problems for both these quarterbacks this upcoming year. moving on to the Big Ten, it's USC and Oregon are the teams that I think can really compete. Washington can absolutely be thrown in there as well, but the biggest adjustment for me is actually what everyone's been talking about in the SEC. It's the physicality that is going to come in the Big Ten for these teams, because the reality is the Big Ten is a run-first league, period, end of story. The teams that have won the title the last couple of years have led the conference in rushing, and that is no coincidence. That's the way they go about business, and frankly, I think even Oregon and USC walking into this conference is not going to change that. But USC and Oregon do spread the ball around. That's the way they go about business. They're going to have elite wide receivers. They're going to have guys that absolutely are going to stretch this field, and maybe it hurts Big Ten defenses. Maybe it goes the opposite direction. Oregon and USC are able to attack some of these defenses that are a little bit more equipped to stop the run, a little bit more intent on stopping the run rather than, getting out and covering guys way downfield. So maybe it opens doors for them. Who knows? But on the flip side, you are coming from a league that is leaps and bounds less physical than what the Big Ten is, and if you have, the right defensive tackles in place, and they brought one over from Michigan State and Derek Harmon for Oregon, and it's definitely one of those things that they can be hard-nosed teams. I'm not necessarily super worried about Oregon being a hard-nosed team. I think they absolutely have the ability to. Are they a hard-nosed team every single week in the cold in November of the Big Ten schedule is the big-time question for me. So that'll be something really interesting to watch. USC is going to get pushed around just a little bit. Depending on where they get pushed around could be a huge thing. If Penn State comes to town and they're able to hold their own, maybe they can get that win and they're off to the races. But at the end of the day, I see a world where Oregon goes to Michigan late in the season. It's cold. It's really tough to play in, and they just get a little bit battered throughout that game and end up on the wrong side of it. USC avoids a trip up north, which is absolutely huge and late in the season. But then you got Penn State coming to town, and that's going to be a stylistic battle, and we'll see who comes out on top. I tend to believe that Penn State's just going to lean on you until you quit. So it'll be really interesting to watch all that. I think the physicality, everyone talks about how much it's going to affect Texas and Oklahoma as they head into the SEC. I think it might have a bigger impact on Oregon and USC and Washington and UCLA as they head into the Big Ten. But moving on to the Big 12, because I would love to break down the ACC here. There's not a lot of teams that I really think are going to compete for the ACC. I do like that SMU team, and I think they're going to make some noise, but overall, there's also not too many differences between, the Big 12 or Pac-12 way of things, the ACC. So overall, the ACC is one of those conferences that is harder to get a beat on because there's so many more variables. And overall, I don't think there's a real contender. I think there's teams that can really get in that mix, but not sure anyone's going to be taking home that trophy by any means. But in the Big 12, it's all about, Utah. Utah's the team that everyone's pointing to, and they're saying this is going to be the team that absolutely dominates this conference in a lot of ways. And frankly, they could. There's no doubt about that. And there was a lot of similarities between Pac-12 football and Big 12 football. When you talk about, I just talked about the drop 8 coverage that they play a lot in the Big 12. They do a lot of the same in the Pac-12. And it was actually one of the reasons that Caleb Williams was just so incredible, was they gave him plenty of time to play around with. So definitely something to watch as they get into this. But also the other part of this was Utah kind of lived in the Pac-12 just being physical. That was the way that they won games. They got onto the field and said, you are not going to beat us at the line of scrimmage. You're not going to, get away from open field tackles. We're going to make every single play, and it's going to be really physical in the process. That's the goal when you go into the Big 12, but it's not necessarily as easy as it was in the Pac-12, where you have Oklahoma State, you have Kansas State, you have Iowa State, you have West Virginia, a number of other teams that maybe they can't outright match Utah, but they can match them better than Washington State did. They can match them better than Arizona State did. So overall, there are more teams here that can get on the field and say, we are not the less physical team on the field, even when they're on the field with Utah. That was rarely the case in the Pac-12. So could that be the biggest difference? Could that be the thing that really gets in their way, where they feel like they can just, keep the status quo, keep being a physical run-first team, and maybe it just doesn't work out the way that they hope in their new conference? And then you talk about Kyle Whittingham. I have a hard time worrying about this team overall. I think there are going to be a team that is going to have plenty to say in this conference, but at the end of the day, there are hurdles. He's a very, very good defensive coach, and they're going to be plenty physical. There's just also going to be a number of other teams that are going to be plenty physical on a Saturday. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. In fact, we'll get into it a little bit later in the in a couple of segments here. I apologize, but overall, I think the question becomes, all of these teams look incredible on paper. Oregon and Texas are two of the most deep rosters, most talented rosters in the entire country. Utah's walking into the Big 12 with as much hype, as much talent as you could possibly want. The question is, are all of the differences going to be enough to stifle them? Are they going to get into this league and feel really confident in their ability, feel really confident in all of the guys that they have, but the difference in the road environments that they're going to go into, the difference in the defensive play style, the difference in, the physicality in some respects, all of that stuff is going to play a part in this season. So Texas could be a fantastic team. They could be a top 10 team in the country, but then they walk into Fayetteville and they're not fully prepared for what's on the other side. Or they walk into Kyle Field at the end of the year and they're not fully prepared for what those fans can bring. OU might have to face this even more when they go to, I believe Tennessee comes to them, apologies, but they go to Missouri. They have a game against Auburn. They have a game against Alabama. There's going to be so many different places where it's just going to be different. It's just going to be totally different than what you faced a little bit ago, and conference familiarity, matters. Team familiarity matters. Environment familiarity matters, because when Tennessee walks into Athens, Georgia, they know what they're getting into now. They're not confused about what's on the other side. Texas, they're not walking into Georgia this year, but hypothetically, when they walk into Georgia, that could be a problem because they're not fully aware of what Sanford Stadium has on the other side. The same thing with Neyland, the same thing with Bryant-Denny, the same thing with a million different of these LSU, all of these different places are just going to be harder to play in. So overall, you look at these teams and they're incredibly talented. Oregon and Texas are two of the top four talented teams in the country. There's no doubt about that. The question is that enough? Is it really just, if you have the most talent, if you have the most ability, if you have a quarterback that is experienced, is that enough? Or are there going to be nuances that we don't necessarily see right now that get in the way of these guys doing what they want to do this year, which is compete for that title? But let's take our second break here, and we're going to get into one of the teams I just covered, Oklahoma, and a possible fading into irrelevance over the SEC. Colin Cowherd's take kind of took over my Twitter page for some reason, even in a couple of years after he made it. But we'll get into that right after this, so stick with us.